First on BBC One.
Never get tired of that intro. It's fantastic. And I didn't cook it up this week. Well done, Paul. Brilliant. Okay. I'm Paul. I'm your host. Welcome to the show. This is episode number 7 of History CV of Britain. I'm going to start with an apology. Last week, I forgot to put everyone's comments on the screen. I'm ever so sorry for that. My excuse, which is a genuine one, was I was so engrossed with what Marcel was talking about, I completely forgot everything. So my apologies for that. And I'm extremely tired today, unfortunately, because there was a party next door last night that went on to 4 o'clock in the morning. But I'm very excited about this evening's guest. We've got a new guest for you this evening. So, and on that note, actually, I'm going to take you over very quickly to our guest's website. So hopefully now you can see that on the screen. I'll just double check. Yep, appears to be working. So this is the Mercurial Pathways website, which is mainly a series of blogs on all things megalithic. Now, I found this maybe a couple of weeks ago. I saw this evening's guest after watching her on the Amish Inquisition podcast a couple of weeks ago. So I immediately headed over to her website, where I found this treasure trove of information on megaliths. It's just there's almost 100 blogs on here, and as you can see, some of them are quite extensive. They can take you up to 48 minutes to read a blog. But the information on here is absolutely fantastic. There's lots on metrology, which I'm beginning to realise is an extremely important, albeit dry, subject on megaliths. And there's just so much to absorb on here. So please do visit this website, Mercurial Pathways. Okay, right. Now, one or two other things quickly just to mention before I bring on this evening's guest. So I'm making steady progress with this book, The Holy Kingdom. I still haven't worked out how to put this on the screen without a reverse image. Sorry about that. John Neal told me it's all done with mirrors, Paul. But this is a really great read. I'm about a quarter of the way through now, and it's a lovely beginning to the book because the author, Adrian Gilbert, writes about going to Wales, meeting up with the great Alan Wilson, and Alan Wilson is taking him around places like Llandaff Cathedral, which is a very, very important place and location for this history. And it's extremely enjoyable thus far. So that's all going very well. I finally got around to recording a video about this with the great Hugh Evans. So that's going to be out this week, probably on Thursday, I think. So please watch out for that. That's a recorded video. And I just wanted to point out to everyone before we start tonight that we're all in this together. A lot of this history could end up being deleted. You know, that's not without the realms of possibility. There's a you know, it's very dangerous that we could lose a lot of this important history in this country. And there's lots of people out there like Marcel Abrahams, Hugh Evans, Ralph Ellis, lots of people doing some amazing work and writing some really great books on these topics. So don't forget, please, if you haven't read these books already, these are Hugh Evans's books. That's the first one, Origin of the Zodiac. The second one, which is now sold out and is being reprinted, is The Origin of Numbers. We've got The Origin of Time, which is the latest work of Hugh's. He's currently writing the fourth book at the moment. And I did have a copy somewhere. I know you've all seen it before, probably. There it is, of the Great Migrations to Britain. The two migrations, the first one being Princess Albine's 1527 BC, and then Brutus coming to Britain in 485 BC. So there's some revisionist chronology going on there, but it's such a fantastic book. So much history, beautifully written. Can't recommend it enough. Okay, that's enough waffling by me. Let's bring on this evening's guest. Melissa Campbell of Mercurial Pathways is joining us. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, how are you, Paul?
Very well, other than being a bit tired. Sorry about that. But yeah, all good. Yourself?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent, brilliant. Okay, so I've got so many things to ask you this evening after reading your amazing website. But I suppose we can start by asking you, how did you get into megaliths? What was the starting point on your journey?
Well, I was always into history anyway, just in school, that kind of thing. And I enjoyed reading history books. I read the Graham Hancock books and Robin Heath and John Michel. And then I got Google Earth and I realized that anyone could look at Google Earth and make connections and just try and figure things out, because there's a whole branch of looking into megaliths which is not being done by academics in universities, which means we can do it. You know, we don't have to ask them for permission. We can just go ahead. So I really enjoy looking at Google Earth, and I made some observations, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. And so when I found a couple of things, I just wanted to then figure out why that was the case. For example, one thing that really intrigued me was looking on Google Earth. Stonehenge is exactly the same distance from St. Michael's Mount and the Mont Saint-Michel in France, and really within a couple of 100 meters. And I just thought, well, that's weird. And I just looked to see if there was anything about it, and there wasn't. But wasn't sure what to make of it. And then I realized there was also a connection with Skellig Michael, and that then Skellig Michael, the St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, and the Mont Saint-Michel were kind of all aligned. And then I thought, that's kind of weird. There's this whole thing going on. And then I made a connection with Durham and Skellig and the Mont Saint-Michel. They were all the kind of like a triangle, and all sorts of things sort of began to suggest that it would be really interesting to look at megaliths within the broader landscape, not just as isolated sites.
Okay, that's fascinating. What were the two things that you said you discovered at the start of your journey? So what were your earliest discoveries?
So it was basically all about Stonehenge. That's pretty much the first, for some reason, that's the first thing I looked up on Google Earth. Where is Stonehenge and where is it in the landscape? And then I just realized I just started drawing circles, just, like a kid playing with a new toy. just tried different things. And I just thought there must be something in this, because the two mounts are called St. Michael. Then when I looked into it, I realized that around the time that Stonehenge would have been built, these St. Michael mounts, the French one and the Cornish one, weren't actually islands. They were actually just hills connected to the mainland. This happened a bit later, partly I think because of the rising sea levels and the way that Britain has shrunk a little bit over the years and Doggerland has gone and all that, partly because of a tsunami, which I read about later, which happened I think sometime in the 7th or 8th century, and definitely created an island out of the Mont Saint-Michel in France, perhaps also the Cornish one, but I couldn't find out for sure if that had already been an island or not. But the thing is, there are all these connections that were being made, and now you're asking me about megaliths. The Mont Saint-Michel, Skellig Michael, and St. Michael's Mount don't have any megaliths on now that we know about, but they seem to be all connected to this scheme in the landscape. And there's a suggestion that maybe they might have done. So I couldn't find any exact proof that there were megaliths on St. Michael's Mount, but the history does go back a long, long way. And there's proof of some megaliths on the French one. So,
okay. You say Skellig Michael?
Yes, so this is an island off the coast of Kerry.
Yes,
it's a tiny island. It's Star Wars Island, if you like. It's the one that Luke Skywalker spent some time on. And it's really spectacular. It's basically something, it's like a conical piece of rock. There's another smaller one next to it where puffins live. And it's quite a way off the Irish coast. Sort of like next post is Canada kind of thing. It's really quite far out. But you can still see the mainland from it. And it's a place that was a holy island. And it was a monastery for a very long time until the whole idea of suffering to be a monk kind of died out and people went back to the mainland. But for a long time, it was a sacred place. And then I wondered, well, why is it a sacred place? And then I became interested in sacred places generally, and maybe other sacred places are on the sites of these ancient, important parts of a potential megalithic plan, you know? For example, cathedrals, for example, London.
Yeah. One of the things that amazes me about megaliths is I keep discovering new places all the time. They're everywhere, aren't they? It's incredible. There's so some amazing sites being discovered in India, or being brought to the fore, I should say, in India. Some incredible places.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and one that's amazing, that's really far, far away, but it's still a megalith, is in Tonga. Far, far away, you know, like beyond New Zealand, if you like. It's not made of the same kind of stone that you'd see, for example, at Stonehenge. It's kind of got that kind of barnacle-y look about it, but it's got the same kind of structure as like this kind of like T-shaped two pillar type things with an extra stone on top. It's the same culture, which is amazing.
That sounds like Göbekli Tepe. Am I right?
Yeah, well, yes, Göbekli Tepe is the T-shaped pillars, but I don't know if there was anything then connecting them on a horizontal level. But the one on Tonga is similar in a sense to a sort of like a mini Stonehenge.
Brilliant. Okay, so when we're using the term megaliths, what do we mean by this term, Melissa?
Well, basically, it's anything that's made with large rocks, large stone. It just comes from the Greek word mega and then the Greek word lithos, so large stone. So it could mean any kind of structure that's built from massive stones. There could be stone circles, domes, even step pyramids. Even really, if you think of it, the Great Pyramid of Giza is kind of a megalithic structure because the blocks that were used were absolutely massive. And basically, there's no, and we're focusing on Britain, but there's no limit to where they're found in the world. It's everywhere. The Atlantic seaboard, and when we think of the Atlantic seaboard, we think generally of, you know, the UK, Ireland, France, maybe Portugal, and maybe down to Morocco. But they're also found in the Azores, kind of like something like 5,000 kilometers out into the Atlantic. They're also found on the east coast of America, a few anyway. They're also found in the Mediterranean, so we've got, you know, Greece, Malta, but then also you can go to South America and Japan. It's amazing.
Yes, Japan is one of the places I've looked at recently, and some of the megaliths you find on Japan are amazing. They're incredible. They're huge.
Yeah, and sometimes you can see different layers of construction in these old buildings, and the lowest, sort of oldest level would be made of these megalithic type stones, and very often you see them in these kind of odd shapes. You know, they're kind of all really, really tightly arranged together somehow. I don't know how. And then there'll be some other style of construction then above them.
Fascinating. Okay, sorry, before I forget, Melissa, I've got to put a couple of comments on screen because I forgot last week. Marchell Abrahams is in the house. That's wonderful. Hello, Marchell. And she loves my waffle. I can't imagine why, but there we are. Amish is here as well. That's Amish Phil, who of course lives at the bottom of an enchanted garden in a toadstool. And he says, Melissa is a star. She certainly is. Wonderful researcher.
Paul is a star. And Phil is a star.
He certainly is. Yes, he certainly is. I like what Phil's doing. His guests are always really, really interesting. You know, I've never seen a dull episode ever. It's a really great.
No, really interesting and really broad range of subjects.
Yeah, and he's on right after me, so don't miss the Amish Inquisition tonight. Marcel says your intro is fantastic. It certainly is. It's a lot to live up to, but I'm doing my best. And we've got Lisa in the house. Hello, Lisa. How are you? Good to see you. Right. Okay. So, Melissa, who do you think erected these megaliths, and were they all done roughly at the same time? Was it all done by the same culture? And what are the best sources for this global phenomenon?
Okay, so in a very broad way, I think it's basically, all you can say is it's our ancestors. If you like, you could be more specific and say it's the Druids in this part of the world, and it's the Brahmins in the Indian subcontinent, and it's the priests in the Egyptian sites. I mean, I think it's quite well known that there were groups of people who were studying the stars and mathematics and geometry over a long period of time, and it took a very, very long time to, if you like, qualify, if that's not an anachronism, to basically become a proper fully fledged Druid or whatever. And so they had these schools, and they studied very, very carefully the skies and other things. And Julius Caesar mentions this about the French, or the Gauls rather, that they were basically really, really into astronomy. And so if you look at the megaliths, you can see some interesting astronomy. This isn't something that's accepted really by most academic researchers into it. But if you look at some heretics like Professor Alexander Thom, and a lot of people studying at the moment who are putting their things out online, there's some really interesting geometry. For example, the circles that we think about when we think of stone circles aren't actually circles. Most of them, they're kind of ellipses. And so it's interesting to then see how are they actually formed, because there are triangles and squares inside these ellipses. And then Tom had identified an egg in Brittany as well. It's literally like an egg. And all of these have a purpose, and they're all linked to astronomy, which is really interesting. And then you mentioned metrology being a dry subject, so the study of ancient measures. But when you put it all together in the mix, it actually becomes so interesting, because the metrology has got all these numbers in it that are linked to astronomical cycles. And another thing that's really interesting is that you get all these units popping up. If you read them in these units, rather, for example, we'll say the inch or the foot, the English foot, then you see all these astronomical numbers coming through, which suggests that the inch and the foot are really, really, really old. So who built the megaliths? Well, it's kind of hard to say, but it's definitely connected to that culture that gave the worlds the Druids and the Brahmins and the priests in Egypt. And I think it's definitely a worldwide phenomenon. But if we're going to be thinking about the UK or Britain in particular, then I think you just have to think that we don't really know, because there just aren't any records that go back far enough. And it's just a bit of a mystery, to be honest. But definitely they're very, very old. At least I'd say for most of them 3,000 years, 5,000 years old, so 3,000 BC. And there just aren't enough texts for us to know. I think it's interesting to go back to the texts that we do know from other parts of the world, in the knowledge that it's a global phenomenon, and get clues from, say, Plato or the Rig Veda, and think about what they're saying about geometry and astronomy, because it probably applies, I think, to what was going on in Britain.
Yeah, great answer. 1 second, I'm just going to show you something here that I've got. We mentioned metrology. This book is big enough to kill someone with. This is John Neal's All Done with Mirrors.
Yeah.
Which I'm kind of reading very slowly. As I've said, it's a very dry subject. It's very interesting, but there are certain concepts, I suppose, within this book that I struggle with a bit. Would you be able to recommend a book on metrology for a layman like me, a beginner? Is there any?
Well, John Neal is actually one of the best, and also, of course, John Michel.
I've read some John Michel.
Yeah. No, most of the books on metrology, especially, well, actually, maybe it's better to say it this way, most of the work that's being done on metrology now is not necessarily being put out into books. It's kind of all online. Plus, it tends to get a little bit technical. So it's very difficult to find a way into it unless you're actually prepared to think about what the numbers mean and get a calculator.
Yes, I haven't done any maths since I
So
was
it is
school.
from that point of view. Yeah, from that point of view, it's a little bit difficult to get into, but you have to kind of like go with it, you know, and just say, okay, I don't hate numbers for half an hour. I'm just going to try and do this. Because I know numbers can be really, really, you know, they remind you of school and in not a good way.
I guess so. I mean, I do find it interesting, but there's some terminology in here that I just, you know, when you read a book and you want to just get into it and let it flow, and sometimes I'm having to look up words and look up certain things, and you know.
If you're not, I mean, John Neal is very technical as well, but if as a good way to start, I would say go to the film The Revelation of the Pyramids. It's originally a French film. Have you seen that? The Revelation of the Pyramids. So it's made by this guy called Patrick Trouillard. Yeah, and in the film, he uses this device of this anonymous informer. Really, it's Jim Allison. Jim Allison is fantastic, by the way. He's based in the States. Amazing. He's got amazing research. It was he who found this massive alignment that goes all the way around the world, and various points on it are separated by phi ratios and all the rest of it. So Jim Allison is really the main secret informer. Also, this other French guy from 150 years ago, and Belgian. And so Jim Allison is a great way to start, and Revelation of the Pyramids, just to get into the idea, basically, first of all, that there was a very sophisticated and numerate culture around 5,000 years ago.
Absolutely. Okay. Marto Abrahams is saying, I wonder if Melissa has read the astonishing Uriel's Machine.
Yeah, that's the Christopher Knight and Butler, isn't it?
I think so. I haven't read it myself.
Yeah, or is it Robert Lomas? The one of them does one book with one and Robert the other. But yes, I have read it, and they're fantastic. And all of those books, Christopher Knight, Robert Lomas, fantastic. Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, and we've got.
And they talk about metrology, but they have a different take. So the thing is, with all these people, there's no unified sense of like, oh, this was the metrology of like this time. John Neal has a particular take, you know, and then which is basically the same as John Michel's. Jim Allison is different again, and then their take is different again. They're really into the number 366 and the megalithic inch and all these other things. So it's slightly different, but again, it's just the same general approach that these people were super smart. And if you don't look for signs of sophistication, you're not going to find them.
Okay. Marcel is saying here, aha, my favorite topic. The imperial system is based on quadrants of the Earth. The metric system is based solely on the equator, and Earth is an oblate spheroid.
So actually, that's right, Lomas and Knight, yes. So what you could say about the meter is that it's, on the one hand, a modern idea. You divide the polar circumference into 40,000 parts, you get the kilometer, and then another 1,000 parts, you get the meter. And then the equatorial circumference lends itself very well to the foot, the English foot, and also to the inch. And also, you could say, if you're looking at the equatorial circumference, that if you multiply the number, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to numbers now. Okay. 4,320,000, so 4,320,000. If you multiply that by the number of days in a year, that gives you a period that the Indians would call the yuga. So it's one of those mega cycles that they had. It's a yuga. And basically that's the amount of inches that you get in the equatorial circumference.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's really close. It's to within a mile or two, depending on how you measure it, and depending if you use the sidereal or the tropical year. But it's really, really close. And I mean, there are different ways of looking at it. And then if you look at lots of types of different measures from the ancient world, especially the Middle East, because they seem to be the best preserved and the best documented, you can actually read them in terms of meters and centimeters, and see that actually when you put them all together, someone was dividing the polar circumference into parts, which became these numbers and the meter. And it's lots of people have independently found that the meter is definitely there in the ancient world. I mean, Howard Crowhurst, I forgot to mention Howard Crowhurst. Phil has interviewed him. fantastic researcher. Maybe that's a better place to start. Howard Crowe has a channel as well, a YouTube channel, and lots of books. So he's independently found the meter. And I think he said that at the beginning he was a bit sheepish about saying it because he's already far out enough and people were going to think he was completely mad. But other people have found the meter. David Kenworthy, Jim Allison, Stephen Dale, all sorts of people. And just when you put everything together, you realize that somebody knew definitely the equatorial circumference and the polar circumference because it's there in all the measures and in the monuments.
Fantastic. Okay. Amish is back in the house. Need to check out Uriel's machine. So do I. The Hiram Key was one of the books responsible for my journey into all this stuff. Another book I haven't read, The Hiram Key. Have you read that one, Melissa?
Yeah, so this is about the beginnings of Freemasonry. It's really, really good as well. And Freemasonry is also a really interesting way to get into this because somehow, and it's not no coincidence, I suppose, they're connected to stonemasons who were maybe in a long line of like people building these monuments. You know, they have all this information and they have certain numbers that are key, like the number 33, and 33 is a particular astronomical cycle, and there are other aspects about it as well that are interesting. It's a really good book to get into.
Okay, I've made a note of that one. Cheers, Phil. Okay, let's see if we've got any more comments quickly, and then we'll go back to questions. So Ian Briggs, who was in the house last week, has said they had it all mapped out because they had the right idea about the correct shape. And he said the measurer was female.
I don't know who the measurer was, but they definitely seem to have known that about the oblate spheroid, definitely. Because, and this is something that you don't get in the texts. You don't, like, I don't know of any text like from ancient Greece or something that says, oh, the earth is an oblate spheroid. They just say it's a sphere. They know it's round, all right, but they don't say specifically that it's a bit, that it's got a bulge, you know. And so that must come from an earlier time. And that's one of the things that's really interesting, that there's lost knowledge that the ancient Greeks that we think about were actually the inheritors of this other long lost knowledge, and they didn't necessarily understand everything that they were saying and talking about, and they certainly didn't give credit to the people they were reading about. So there are a couple of ways in which you can see this, but I think I'm fairly sure now that there's a much older, sophisticated culture, and by comparison, the ancient Greeks that we know about, that they were getting there, but they weren't in the same ballpark.
Okay, you mentioned an older culture. Have you come across the books of Hugh Evans?
So yes, but I haven't read them yet. I have had a look because you told me about Hugh. Hi, Hugh. Yeah. And I haven't yet, but I will. It definitely looks really, really good.
They're fantastic. And basically, the premise is, it's about the star maps of Gwynedd that he's discovered. And they go back at least 10,000 years. So basically, our ancestors in Wales were mapping out the stars above on the ground below. They came up with the names of the constellations, our number system and what we call our numbers, our concepts of time. And he's kind of proved it with etymology and translating into the Welsh what these words like Leo, Taurus, what they mean in the Welsh. And it's like, oh my God, it's just incredible. So there's definitely something going on. Hugh's made a great discovery with all that.
That sounds fantastic. And that's another example of the continuity that you get. You know, I mentioned about the foot and the inch and the meter and other units that survived. And that's another example that there's this sense of continuity. I mean, a lot of stuff was lost and a lot of stuff was reinvented, but still there are a few places where there's this line that goes back.
Absolutely. Ian Briggs has chipped in with 8-pointed star in lodges at Vatican, and on magnets is standstill star Polaris. Yeah, okay. And
so this is about the precession, is it, in terms of the different stars that are in the place of the celestial north? Is that what you mean, Ian?
Possibly. Just confirm that for us, please, Ian.
Oh, yes, the Bear constellation is still going on. Yeah, so that's the Great Bear, and in particular the constellation of the saucepan with the 4 and the 3. That's basically going around and round in this long cycle of equatorial precession, turning of the stars.
Okay. So just going back to Britain,
Mhm.
I think there's something like just under 1,000 stone circles in Britain, far more than any other country in the world. So why so many? Why is there even one? What are we supposed to make of them, and what were they for?
That's a lot of questions.
I know.
Well,
Sorry.
I think for first of all, for some reason, the lands that have become Britain today, and Ireland and France as well, were absolutely considered to be sacred. And I think that that's why they were part of a vast system, as I think we've shown. But they were basically, certain spots would have been much more important than others. And then there are other spots in the world that you see there's a high concentration of really important spots. There's a whole line through the Himalayas that's like got like loads of temples on the same latitude, and 3 of the 4 sacred Buddhist mountains are on the same latitude. So there are definitely these spots in the world which are considered important. So I think Britain was considered important. Now, there wasn't a lot of ice covering Britain for a while, and there was more land like Doggerland and other places that have since been lost to the water. But for some reason, it was considered very, very important. And I guess to understand the landscape, you have to look at all sorts of different factors. For example, the place of Britain or different areas in Britain in relation to divisions of the polar circumference. John Michel showed this in terms of Avebury, that it was at a particular division of the polar circumference. And then how all these sites are linked together. So, for example, there are certain sunrise azimuths, so that's like the angle of where the sun is rising on the horizon, and one sacred site that, if you were to follow the line of that azimuth, leads to another sacred site. And so, I mean, why, especially in Britain, I don't know. It's very hard to say. But it's also, I think, to do with the fact that they've been preserved, and maybe elsewhere they haven't.
Okay. Because I was going to say, do you think it's possible that the megalithic culture started in Britain, given that we've got so many stone circles and megaliths?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. Again, how can we know? How can we date that? But I think the fact that there's such a great concentration does point to that, definitely, because I think that they was very, very good at astronomy with these people. We know that from examining the dimensions and the geometry and the alignments, the astronomical alignments of the megaliths, which implies that they were good navigators, and they could have gone all around the world, including to the Americas, including to Japan, all the way around. So they could have spread this culture, and they could have basically been the starting point. Having said that, it could have been in Egypt, it could have been in India. There's a very interesting book about the history of astronomy where this is a book that dates back a couple of hundred years, but it's in the book they're trying to think about this question: where does all this amazing knowledge come from? And at this point, they're kind of thinking about astronomy really, but ancient astronomy, and they reckoned it would be somewhere up north, judging by bits and pieces that they had examined from various ancient sources, that it corresponded to a fairly northern latitude, wherever this came from, which is interesting.
Okay. Right. Let's ask you another question. I want to ask you about the cursus at Stonehenge. You know, the ditch. What was the purpose of that ditch, do you think? Because I was reading about this week, and whoever was writing it, I don't know where it was now, but they were suggesting that it was like an early Roman athletic track or something like that, which I thought sounded a bit stupid. But what do you think?
Well, it's not impossible. It's not impossible. I think that basically, so everything is part of this view, I think, in which the world is alive. It's the cosmos is alive. It's a kind of a panpsychist view. And so this track here, you didn't have said track because you said track, but this long cursus, okay, it could have been for running around, but it's important to look at the dimensions and to see that it was designed very, very carefully. It could have been to do with astronomical observations as well. It could have been also with just marking a particular point because it was a certain distance from another point. It could have been about securing in history a particular direction, that you would be looking at a particular direction of particular sunrise or something, or a particular sunset, because it's roughly east-west. So there are lots and lots of ideas, but I had to think about this, and I had to look about, over what I've had, and I have to say there's no one theory that stands out that says, oh my God, that's definitely what it was. I think with Stonehenge, you have to look at the broader Stonehenge area, just as elsewhere, but particularly all around Stonehenge, there's a lot going on. There are those burrows as well that kind of are all the way around Stonehenge, which possibly point to sort of like a reinterpretation of what's going on in the heavens, and they map out the different parts of the path of the Great Bear around the northern celestial north. And then this has to fit in with all that. I feel it's all from the same point. If you look at Stonehenge, another interesting fact is in terms of sunshine and the sun, is that May Day, the 1st of May, is a really interesting day there, and it's to do with the latitude of Stonehenge. And so if you were to calculate basically the ratio of daylight to darkness on the 1st of May at Stonehenge, you get the number 5, which is the golden ratio. And I think that's a big part of the importance of the site, because there's a very important ratio, and it's a very important time of year. It's one of those cross-quarter days. We just had Imbolc a couple of days ago, 1st of February, and then that's the 1st of May. And I think these dates in the calendar go way, way back as well. So it's never had anything built on it. It survived. So we have the whole landscape to go by. It's never had like a cathedral stuck on it, like an old Sarum or something. So we have a lot of information at Stonehenge that we haven't got maybe elsewhere. Perhaps London was a really important megalithic site. I'd say it probably was, but there's no way it's going to have survived now. But if you look at the sunshine and what's going on in these various sites, I think that's a really interesting key to trying to figure out what's going on, and maybe the cursus is part of that.
I think so, yeah. And the ditch at Avebury is huge, isn't it? It must be at least 30 or 40 foot deep, I think. So, I mean, why would they bother doing that? And how did they do it?
Well, it's not defensive, that's for sure, because it's the wrong side. That's agreed upon. I did watch a video a couple of months ago where a very, very cheerful archaeologist was doing a video about it, and she said, and this was definitely for a cattle market, because that's why there's a ditch, and there were bones of cows found here, so it was definitely a cattle market.
Oh dear.
I don't think so. But look, there were different ways of interpreting everything. I think partly it might have been to do with creating a mound big enough that was for leveling the land. They needed a lot of ground, a lot of earth to kind of create what they needed in the center of the henge.
Yeah. But
it may have been about just basically a sacred boundary. That this is absolutely sacred inside here, and then everything without is slightly different. And if you look at the dimensions, they're also very interesting at Avebury, and I think that is another sort of sign that this is it's part of a very sophisticated system. In fact, another thing that's the reason why it's so big is that different sides of the henge connect to different places. For example, if you connect the eastern side with a line that goes roughly south, it will head to Old Sarum and Salisbury, and then ultimately the Mont Saint-Michel. And again, we have the Mont Saint-Michel. Or else if you have a slightly different sort of direction, a little bit further south, it goes to Stonehenge, of course, and there's that whole series of megalithic monuments that everyone knows about. That's Stonehenge to Avebury and a few other bits in between, Silbury Hill, West Kennet Long Barrow, and etc. etc. So it could be that it's to do with that. Tom measured the Aubrey circle diameter as 86.44 meters, And you could interpret that as very sophisticated geometry again. So if you were to draw a circle with a diameter of, I'm going to give you some numbers, but just go with it, 320 feet. And if you were to square that circle, so it's this process by which you have a circle and then you do a square of the same perimeter or the same area. If you just square that circle, that would give you a square with sides of basically the diameter of the circle of the Aubrey circle. So there's a whole lot of potentially really interesting geometry going on with the henge. So a squaring of the circle, possibly. It could also be in terms of the circumference. It gives you in inches a metonic circle in days if you have 1 inch per day. So there are all sorts of different things that you could think about. Sorry, that's the Aubrey circle at Stonehenge, by the way. Sorry, I've gone to the Aubrey circle.
Yeah. Well, just going back to Avebury, I heard a theory once that was slightly out there, I think, but where they were postulating that Avebury used to be connected to a very local river, and that there was once upon a time a waterway basically where the ditch is and stuff. So
I think that's a really nice idea.
I mentioned it to Maria Wheatley, and I don't think she was very impressed with it. But who knows?
Well, water is very important, and then why shouldn't they have diverted a river and put a bit of water around, say, Avebury? It would have made it extra special. So, I think it's a really nice idea.
Too, yeah, and water was very important to the Druids.
Yeah, exactly. And no, I think that's nice. It could have had practical reasons as well, because it creates a very flat surface if the water's still, that you could maybe use to make measurements in terms of astronomy, which is another reason why it had to be so quite deep and quite wide.
That's fascinating. Okay, Marcel has said, my theory is that Earth being the head half of Tiamat and the asteroid belt the body half, we built stone circles in emulation of the belt. That's an interesting theory. I've not heard that one before.
So Tiamat is in the Babylonian myths. She's the one who's killed, right, in the creation myth, and she's basically Mother Earth in a sense. So I think this goes back to the sort of panpsychist cosmic view of the Earth. And this is something that I've come to through the numbers, which is another way that makes for me the numbers really, really interesting. I've come to this idea that they were panpsychists because it's the only way that makes sense of all these numbers. They have all these numbers about astronomy in the diameters and the circumferences and this and that and the distances between places. And I actually think you have to go back to the creation myths. And for example, there's usually someone who's mutilated, or there's some cutting or some separation. You start off with this kind of like primeval matter, and then time suddenly appears in it, and then this kind of like divine breath gets in it, but there's nothing much happening. It's basically just like chaos, actually. That's what they used in the Greek myths. And then somehow there's like this division, like a cell dividing, and then everything starts happening. So the first division is heaven and earth, and so we have Tiamat being killed by Marduk. And then there are more divisions, and so all the other things are being created. And this is all around the world. This is like the body of Mother Earth. You know, you have these things about like the hill of this particular hill, in some places the shoulder of the Mother Earth God, and you know, and like the tears of the rivers and all this. Like, it's all coming back to this idea that the cosmos is alive, and it's all to do with, as a result of our role in a living being, because we are just one part of this living being, we have a duty to make sure all the other parts of the living being are functioning well. And so this is why we have to study the stars and encode the information that we have in the monuments that we construct, in the calendars, in the music perhaps as well, in order to show that we understand the world, that we're kind of in it, and that we are like making everything in accordance with cosmic law, or whatever kind of law you want to call it. That in Egyptian tradition, it's I've forgotten the word now. The word where it's cosmic law, basically. It's in China, it's Tao, the way, you know, all the different cultures have it. And I think it's just part of that. So yeah, possibly it's Tiamat.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
While you were saying that, I was thinking, this is something I've always kind of, I don't know, sort of fantasized about, I suppose, really. But with these megalithic sites like Stonehenge and Avebury, do you think there's any sort of possibility that they could have been portals to other dimensions? I know that sounds a little bit far out, but I've seen one or two things when I visited these places that I won't disclose on this show, but are they magical places, Melissa?
They certainly are in the myths and the stories and the legends. I think that's one of the reasons they were preserved. I mean, in Ireland, where I live, a lot of those mounds have been preserved because people were frightened of them, because they really felt that the fairy folk were living there, and the fairy folk are not to be messed with. And there's definitely an idea that they're portals. Absolutely. This is in so many of the stories. You can go into them, you can come out through them. There are different rhythms of time that happen on the other side. And there's the story of people going to the island of the blessed, or the place where you stay young forever, and then somebody coming back and stepping out back into this world and accidentally touching the ground and suddenly becoming 500 years old or something and dying on the spot. And there are all sorts of stories of fairy abductions, and which have maybe morphed into alien abductions in recent decades. And I think they're very often linked to these places. Why that is, I have no idea. Is it true? I don't know. I'd like to find out more about this. And I know that there are people who do dowsing who have found interesting things as well in these places. I have a friend who's a geologist. She actually specializes in underground water. And I showed her a book I had a few years ago, which showed the underground streams under various sacred places. And she just laughed in my face. So I don't know.
Okay. Did you hear about the stone at Stonehenge that used to produce water?
In Scotland.
Did you hear about the stone at Stonehenge that used to produce water?
Oh,
Yes.
no.
No,
I
yeah,
don't think I
this
have.
is something that Maria Wheatley told me. I don't know if you know Maria Wheatley. I've got
I know her work a little bit,
there we go.
yes.
There's the book there, The Secret History of Stonehenge.
All right.
That's a great read. Only came out last year, I think. Yeah, so there was this stone that used to produce water. And I think it was at some point in the middle of the last century, they kind of investigated it. They could not find the source of the water, so they concreted it up. So yeah, basically that's what Maria told me, and she's a really good source of knowledge on Stonehenge. But it reminded me of Geoffrey of Monmouth, because in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain, in it he records Merlin saying that people used the water from the stones to bathe in to heal themselves. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That is really interesting. So
yeah, this is another aspect of these ancient stones that's really interesting. It's so hard to find out about them. Now, if that source was blocked up, that would be a real shame. But there are definitely underground sources in other sacred places. Like I live fairly close to the Hill of Tara in the famous place with the concentric rings, and there are other
yes.
shapes, if you like, under the grass that you can step on. And there are, I think, 7 holy wells at Tara, which is quite a lot. And they're all sacred. And then there's all sorts of other stuff going on. But there isn't a river as such, because it's kind of at the top of a hill, really. It's not a very tall hill. But these sacred wells are very important. It's a very important part of the whole thing. I think it's the thing is, it's so hard to find out more about those things unless you're a person who can sense the energies, or who can, maybe as a dowser, you could sense the energies. I don't know exactly if it's linked as well to the theme of the dragon, which is often found in some of these sites, especially Michael and the dragon, to go back to St. Michael. But a lot of people associate the dragon with water. And again, this is an interesting thing to pursue, but I'm not sure if it's possible to basically understand these watery sites in relation to something that's like for healing, or that's something that's more practical, or for astronomy. It's very hard to say.
Okay. What do you make of Silbury Hill? I think for me, it would be a toss-up between Silbury Hill and the Glastonbury Tor as to which one would be my favourite site. we've got other step pyramids, because Silbury Hill is obviously a step pyramid. So we've got other step pyramids in places like Mexico and China. What are your thoughts on Silbury Hill? And I've got to ask you as well about buried pyramids, because I find these very interesting. So what are you
About what?
buried
Sorry.
pyramids?
Well, okay. Was the theme of buried pyramids? Well, I think a lot of the time they're not necessarily buried deliberately. They're buried because the cultures have moved on and they're forgotten about, as in China, as in the Amazon rainforest. Have you seen that? So there's a lot going on there at the moment. There's a lot of research being done with LiDAR and aeroplanes. So they're discovering a lot there. So that will be interesting. But I think in China, they've deliberately covered some of the pyramids with trees and earth in order to disguise them or to kind of basically tone them down, because they somehow don't align with, well, they just don't align with the religion of the day.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. There was that so-called pyramid in Bosnia, if you remember, but I think Robert Schoch went along and said it's not a pyramid. It is actually
I must
just
admit,
a
I mean,
mountain.
if you're a child looking at that, at that scene in Bosnia, that would be my first thought. Oh my God, that's a pyramid, because the shape is so geometrical, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's another, have you seen, there's a mountain in somewhere in the South Pole that also has a kind of like a quite artificial look about it. It's got these
There's
kind of
one or two like that in the South Pole. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, and people have done videos on them. And look, I don't know about those. I would say in the case of Silbury Hill, it's actually a really interesting part of the whole, I was going to say, ritual sacred landscape next to Avebury, and it possibly symbolizes our planet, and then Avebury would be the sun.
Okay.
And this is a theory that was arrived at by William Stukely, a couple of hundred years ago. So he basically had this idea that there's a serpent, massive serpent, all around Avebury, which symbolizes it's procession, basically the movement around the North Star, all around the celestial north, and basically, so other sacred monuments in the area are the other planets. And David Kenworthy has also found that, by the way. He's had a look at that and identified the links between the positions of certain monuments and various planets. So Silbury then would be our planet, and the word is supposed to have come from simply just great. So the great barrow, the Sil barrow, because this is a Saxon word. So, for example, we have other places like Silchester, which is the Great Chester. And so Silbury Hill would be just the Sil barrow, so the Great Barrow, the large barrow, the elevated barrow. There's also Stukely thought about maybe it might be Sul, as in the sun, but if it's supposed to be the earth, then it doesn't really fit anymore. So I think that Sil barrow works quite well. And it's definitely really interesting in terms of its position with Avebury, and then the other places that are on this broad line, so to include several other places, barrows and things, all the way down to Stonehenge. It's a really mysterious place. It's probably one of the most mysterious places, actually, because it's got an odd shape. It's absolutely massive.
You go there, it's like, oh my God, it's vast. It's a huge thing,
Yeah. Actually, one of the things Stukely says, I think he says, it must have cost £20,000 to build. This is a couple of hundred years ago, because now you wouldn't even get an extension on your house for that. But you can imagine him thinking about the work involved and going, oh my God, what was this about? And possibly also Glastonbury Tor. I mean, I don't know exactly what the structure is inside, and it's a different shape, but it's a similar kind of idea that you have this massive earth mound, and it's in a very important place. It's connected to all these other places in very particular ways, in precise ways. And again, it reminds us of the Vedic texts, the Plato, the Tao in the Chinese tradition, which is all about aligning our actions with the cosmic rhythms, the human role in the cosmic order, maintaining cosmic balance. So it's it's so mysterious already on its own. But when you think of it in the broad picture with all the other megalithic monuments, it's just really, really intriguing. And you think of the landscape as a sacred place, it's definitely part of that. So it's the living cosmos and all these geometric alignments. And so that's what I mean when I got to this idea of the living cosmos through the numbers, because it's not just an isolated feature. It's part of alignments, and it's got particular. It's a particular distance from Avebury and other places like the Great Cursus, Darrington Walls.
I think you're absolutely spot on there. I can confirm. I don't know if you know this, but there is a hidden chamber in Silbury Hill. I know this because Maria Wheatley's been inside it. She told me this,
Really?
yeah, and I was very jealous. Yes, there is a chamber inside Silbury Hill. It's a fascinating place. I mean, I've been there quite a few times myself, and I've seen orbs flying around it, very visible, quite large orbs and stuff, and all sorts of weird things. So there is definitely a magical element to these sites. There's no doubt about that at all.
That's an interesting thing as well. That on the one hand, there's science, there's like proper hard science going on, and on the other hand, there's all sorts of other stuff that we would dismiss as completely rubbish and unscientific, mostly. And I think we have to go back to a time where, or in a framework where, these things are not different. It's all part of the same worldview.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Somehow, if we can try and put ourselves in their minds, you know.
Another comment from Ian Briggs. Thank you for commenting, Ian, tonight. Case, circle, ecliptic, movement of time and journey of sun plus lunar plus precession. And he's added 3 great rings of time. And he's added 713 BC, year added 5.24 days. I'm not exactly following that, Ian. Are you, Melissa? Go back to the first.
I'm just going down again. I'm just going down to the beginning. Okay. Sorry. Where was it? So I can't see those numbers now in the comments.
Oh, sorry, the numbers. I did see up 88 constellations charted by ancient people. None have changed.
Well, with the constellations, there's a degree of continuity. There's also lots and lots of change, and different cultures have different constellations. It's interesting to look at the Dendera zodiac from Egypt, although it's from post Alexander the Great times, where they have very similar constellations to us. And then some of them are slightly different, but some of them are there, you know, like the scales for Libra and all that. So that's interesting. And also to go back, if you want, in terms of continuity, to like the caves at Lascaux in France, where you have a kind of something a bit like a bull, like an aurochs, with these like marks on the side, which are the Pleiades, I think. So the Pleiades really are, in fact, part of Taurus, the constellation. So that's a suggestion that there's continuity. So something about the Bali goddess.
Just going to get that up. Ian said Bali goddess Demeter Persephone. I'm probably saying.
So Persephone was married to Hades against her will, and she's a symbol of the seasons. She was the daughter of Demeter, and she was kidnapped by her lovely uncle with her father's permission, Zeus, and she had to spend some time down in the underworld because she was forced to be married to Hades. She unfortunately ate a little bit of pomegranate, and because she'd eaten the food down there, she was kind of stuck. But they did a deal, and she was allowed to come up for some of the time during the year. So she's a personification of the seasons. So there are quite a few Greek deities like this, whereby they die or they have to go to the underworld in the autumn, and then they come back up in the spring. Adonis is another, you know, Adonis. Demeter was really mad into him, and he had to share his time between two goddesses. Artemis, not Artemis, the beautiful one, Venus in Greek. I can't remember her name now, sorry. Anyway, there were a couple of these personifications of the seasons. No, no, the beautiful one who came out of the sea, the amazing one, Venus in the Greek myth. In the Roman, sorry.
I know who you mean.
Name now. Aphrodite.
That's it. Yeah,
Aphrodite.
well done. Got there in the end.
Yeah, sorry.
Marcel has replied to Ian and has said yes, and in Welsh, Christ is Christ or Grist, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Okay. Okay, right, we're just past the hour now, so I'm going to ask you one more question, if you don't mind, Melissa, before we finish.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll ask you two. So Stonehenge was vandalised by the Romans, according to a friend of mine, Druid Lawrence Main. What's your opinion of that? I just want to add, before you answer, I'm aware that there was, we did a show recently with John Hart, and he was talking about a Greek guy called Pythias, who travelled to Britain in around 325 BC. And,
He travelled
oh,
north.
you're aware of him, are you?
Well, he's the one who kind of like is supposed to have travelled the furthest north.
Yes.
Whether he went to the UK or to Iceland, nobody knows.
Hyperborea, that's right. Now, he wrote about Stonehenge, and he leaves the impression that Stonehenge was fully intact when he visited it. So I don't know if you have any opinions on it. It would stand to reason to me that, you know, the Romans weren't particularly fond of our culture, our great culture. And so your opinion?
Yes, I think it makes sense that they would have done, because that's what all invading powers do. They knock things down. They try to assert themselves. It's just a way of being a bully, really, isn't it? And gaining the upper hand. This is what the Normans did, and this is what the Christians did then with the pagan monuments. You've got St. Gregory of Tours going around knocking pagan temples around left, right, and center, and thinking he's a great guy, you know. And this is something that happens again and again and again. But the weird thing about that is that the same people who come and destroy these pagan temples or whatever kind of temple, because they're disagreeing with the religion or because they want to impose themselves politically, is that they then keep the site and they build something else on the site. For example, a lot of what I think were important places in the megalithic network were then turned into churches, and some of them cathedrals.
Yeah.
And so I think it stands to reason that the Romans would have done that. Whether they did, it's impossible to say, because, like, how can you date that? You can't even date a stone properly, to be honest. It's such a hard thing to do. So whether they did, I don't know, but definitely they could have done. I think there's a whole series of layers in sacred sites, and the site endures, even though the temple itself or the stones get knocked down and replaced. So I think for that reason, you have to assume that a lot of the stuff was lost. Maybe some of it for good, but a lot of the sites that we think are sacred now, for example, St. Paul's Cathedral, or, you know, all the other cathedrals that we have in Britain, are the sites potentially of these megalithic sacred sites. And then you can actually, what I found really surprised me, that some of the alignments that I found go through, first of all, megalithic sites and then a cathedral or two, you know? So they all seem to be linked. So that tells me that people were coming in and knocking down the pagan site and then building something else. So they valued the site.
Makes perfect sense. Where does Avebury and where does Stonehenge get their names from? Do you have any opinion on this at all?
Stonehenge, basically, it's just the fact that there's a kind of a circular mound all around it, and I think it just comes from the local people.
Yeah, it was known as the Giant's Dance, wasn't it, prior to that?
Yeah, so it's had lots of names that other than Stonehenge, but I think it's basically just the fact that there are stones and that there's a henge and that the two went together. I haven't found any really, really good answers to that one, actually. I had a quick look, and the same for Avebury. In fact, I think that Stukely mentions it as, well, he always refers to it as Avebury, so just Avebury. So I'm not sure what the etymology is, actually. It's very mysterious. But definitely the symbolism is that it's the sun for him. And I think that really stands to reason. That makes a lot of sense. So whether it's a word that's then derived from the sun in some way, could be.
Yeah. Okay. This has been fantastic. You're a wonderful source of knowledge on these
Thank
topics.
you for having me. It's really interesting to chat to you.
Yeah. Have you got, are you going to write a book at some point?
Yeah, maybe.
You should. I'd read it.
I just enjoy just doing the research, to be honest. It's a little bit introverted. I just enjoy doing it and putting out the things I find and then moving on to the next thing. But maybe I should try and put out a book, maybe, if someone's going to read it.
I'd read it. So don't forget, everyone, please check out Melissa's amazing website, the blog section. You can get lost in there for weeks, literally. It's fascinating information. Thank you so much for joining me today, Melissa.
Thank you very much,
enjoyed
Paul.
it.
Thank you, everybody.
Pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for your comments. Really appreciated. I'm back next week with the triumphant return of John Hart. Looking forward to that. We'll be discussing the languages of the ancient Britons. So I'll see you next week at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much. Cheers, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. Bye.
Yes.